Antonio. Antonio is not just a colleague, but a friend. So I'm very happy to have him here with us today. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. So first I'll introduce him and then I'll kind of explain to Antonio the rules of the game, since he has been teaching to our students at the GSSI, but face-to-face in the past. So this is a new modality. Okay, so Antonio is full professor at the School of Earth, Environment and Society at the McMaster University in Canada. Fun fact is that back in 2004, 2005, I almost went there to work at McMaster. I visited, I didn't meet Antonio then, but I met all your co-author pretty much. I've seen your co-author list and I met many of them. And then I decided actually to stay in the UK because they offered me a better job. So, you know, I never went to work in Canada, but it's a very nice place. I still remember McMaster and that area very well. So Antonio is an expert of spatial analysis, statistics. He has done work on transportation and travel behavior, GIS, health, geography, and you name it. He has written over 110 papers. He's highly cited. In fact, Antonio, I looked this morning at your Google Scholar citation, and you are too short of 8,000. We need to actually cite you so that we...
Please.
7,998, short of 2. Come on, to round that up. He's the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Geographical System, and he's also in several other geographical journal. And today he's going to talk to us about the value of school to a neighborhood. And so thank you very much for being here. Before I actually let you start your talk, I'll remind you the rules. So we have 2 full hours. We don't have to use them all, but normally what we do, we allow the first hour for the presentation. And so you have up to 1 hour to present. And then the second hour is more for discussion, questions from our PhD students, from the faculty, from whoever is attending, also external. Now, for the attendees, if you are on Zoom, we are recording. So it's implicit that you are okay in being recorded. If that's not the case, you have to leave the Zoom webinar and go to the YouTube channel of the GSSI, because this is also broadcasted on the YouTube channel. You are not recorded there. So that's just a tricky part, but you have to be aware that you are going to be recorded if you are going to stay with us on Zoom. And that's it pretty much. So Antonio, we are really looking forward to listening to your presentation, and thank you very much again for waking up very early and being here with us today.
Thank you so much, Alessandra, and this is fantastic. I'm so happy to be able to join for this seminar. Thank you for the invitation. And so let me quickly explain these slides that I'm going to be using. So there is a website and a code at the top. If you could visit the website and enter the code, you can do that on a mobile device if you have a cell phone with you next to your computer, maybe. That is going to allow you to interact with the slides as we go through the seminar. So if you just take a moment to go to the website, enter the code, and once that you do, give me a thumbs up maybe to let me know that, that you have access to the slides. So while you do that, you can see the title of the presentation is "What's a School Worth to a Neighborhood?" This is research that I wish I had done years and years and years ago for reasons that will become clear, but that has only happened in the past 2 years or so. I hope to explain why that's been a little bit of a challenge. But in the end, this is a piece of research that I have been very interested in, very happy with the results. And let me begin by thanking my co-authors in this. There is a paper behind this presentation. John Merrill, who is a master's student at McMaster University. He has done an amazing job with this project. He has done historical research. He is now our in-house expert on schools in Hamilton. Ask him about a school and he will tell you the story. He will tell you when it opened, when it closed, who went to that school. I mean, he knows everything about the schools now. Chris Higgins, who is a Mac alumnus and now an assistant professor at the University of Toronto in Scarborough. And he is the lead investigator in the project that that funds this research. The research is funded by SSHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. So thank you to the council for supporting this work. Okay, so I see that a few of you have given me a thumbs up. And the other thing that I'll note about the slides is that there is a comments and a questions function. You will see that on your interface. So if you have any comments or questions, feel free to use that and post any comments or thoughts that you may have or any questions. I imagine that there is also that in the chat. So we'll get to those as we progress. Okay, so let me begin by asking, where did you go to school? Where did you go to school? And you can use the interactive slide too.
You mean the location, Antonio?
Yes, the location. So it could be a city, it could be a neighborhood, it could be a country, just to get a sense of where each of us went to school, a little bit of a sense of a geographical distribution of participants. Okay, so we see that people have gone to school in Milan, in L'Aquila, in Rome, a village close to Verona, three in Argentina, Avezzano.
Sorry, can I just laugh? Because I know exactly who is answering what. A village close to Verona, I know who that is.
Mexico, Modena, Pieti, Argentina. So quite a few different places, Ferrara.
Antonio, sorry, you didn't answer, right? So Mexico is not you, right?
Mexico is not me. I didn't answer myself. So there is someone joining us from Mexico or who is originally from Mexico.
We have a PhD student from Mexico.
Okay. Kabul, interesting village close to Pavia in Italy. Fantastic. So thank you for answering that. We see that there is quite a range of places where people went to school. Now let me ask you, United States, maybe I'll give it just a moment in case we have a few other answers. But now let me ask you, I mean, seeing all these different places, Kabul, Modena, Turkey, United States, Mexico, Argentina, a small village close to Pavia and so on. So when you were in school, and that excludes higher education. So let's say kindergarten to, just before university. How did you travel to school? What was your most common mode of transportation going to school, the second most common, and so
on? Sorry, Antonio, you missed bicycle here. I was cycling.
That's right. I forgot that one. Let's say that if you use bicycle, let's put it with walk, just as an active mode of transportation. Thank you. Okay, that is interesting. So I was wondering, seeing as there are many Europeans in the audience, how common, for instance, walking to school would be. And it is something that's become idealized. Walking to school is just, what we would like kids to do. It's healthy. It's something that, can be done independently. So in fact, it's part of what we call children's independent mobility and so on. Public transportation is a little bit part of that. Someone called a trip by public transportation is a continuation of a walking trip. So interesting to see that walk and public transportation are the most common forms of transportation for people about our age and generation. Why is that important? So walking requires proximity to schools. And it's something that, like I said, is valued by a lot of people. Having access to public transportation as well, it allows you, or it demands you to have access to the system that you should be able to walk to a stop, to take a bus that will take you to school. So it's something that people value. That for that reason can, in principle, affect the decisions that people make when deciding where to live. Proximity to a school may be something that is valuable. Okay, so a question. Are your schools still open, if you know? The schools that you attended before higher education.
Which one though? Elementary, middle school, or high school?
So if even one of them closed, choose no.
Okay. I'm the only one. I know. Okay.
So most people's schools are still open. Again, that may reflect where we tend to come from. But school closings is something that that's a phenomenon that happens in regions that are losing population. I know, for instance, that there are regions in the north of Spain where population has been declining and schools have closed. My friends in Oviedo, for instance, they remember fondly their small school that they used to attend and that now has 3 kids and is probably going to close, right?
Antonio, sorry, can I just tell you something though? Okay, yes. This is true for public school. I'm from Milan, so obviously not an area that is losing population. The reason why my high school closed was because it was a small private one. And so it does change with private and public schools. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you, but because it seems strange, right? I'm from Milan, so it's certainly not an area that is depopulating. So my answer seemed a little bit at odds. Sorry.
Yes, no, that's a great point. And yes, so there are multiple reasons why schools close. So that was actually my next question. Why do schools close? And this may be based on your experience. So for instance, Ale, you went to a small private school that eventually closed, but this could be based on your readings or your observations, what you know from the newspapers and so on. So why do you think schools close? I mentioned one important factor that leads to school closures, but there are actually more than we can maybe share. I imagine that, for instance, schools that have what are they called? Not faith schools, but schools run by religious organizations as some countries become less and less religious, that may also mean certain schools who are run by religious organizations may face pressure to close. Canada is an interesting case. In Canada, Ontario at least, there is two parallel public school systems. One that is public and that is non-denominational, and a second system that is Catholic. So that is a relic from the compromises between French-speaking Canada and British Canada. So in Ontario and in other provinces as well, we ended up with two parallel systems that favor Catholic education as public education, but not other denominations. That can be at times, critics say that it's wasteful. So the building has changed. An earthquake. So there is an external shock, financial viability, population change. So population loss, the population leading to not enough number of pupils, merger of two small schools into a larger one for efficiency reasons. They may lose appeal and then applications, right? So these are all good reasons. Sometimes, the population reforms. So one that is not mentioned here, because I suspect is more of an American thing, is performance. And under the Obama administration, there was an incentive to close poorly performing schools. I guess the idea was to, schools that did not do well, close them and start afresh. But sometimes it is old buildings that actually need to be renovated. And then you have more extreme situations like civil conflict or religious conflict, and so on. So a large number of reasons that can lead to school closures. And these are not mutually exclusive. In fact, sometimes there is this synergy of reasons. And you could have population changes combined with old buildings, combined with a pressure from the top to achieve efficiencies in education, right? So then you have like everything going on at once, and it's like, oh, we don't have enough pupils. We have an old school that needs to be renovated, and we also have two smaller schools. Let's just merge it. So that sounds a little bit like what has happened in Ontario, where education is a responsibility of the province. And this will be about 20 years ago or so, the province introduced a new formula used for funding education. And this formula tied capital funding. So the province will say to the school boards, to the local school boards, the province will say, we'll give you money for capital uses, but on the condition that if you have schools that are underutilized, those schools need to be reviewed and often closed. So the key here is the underutilization of schools. So in principle, the policy was, let's improve our stock, our infrastructure, but let's do that in an efficient way by ensuring that we don't have schools that are not being used to close to full capacity. So it's one of those things that the policy seems well-intentioned from the start, but that eventually had what I think were lots of unintended consequences. A key here is the idea of underutilization, which in a place like Ontario, that there is no civil conflict. We don't have major, religious disputes, where there haven't been natural disasters like earthquakes that force massive relocation of people, nothing of the sort. So when we think of underutilization, we think about population loss. The process to implement the capital formula and the review of utilization of schools was called, or is called, accommodation reviews. And this was a process that follows a protocol set by the province, but it's done locally. Ontario also has this funny system where responsibility for education is supposed to be local. So there are local school boards. A school board is basically a political entity. There are trustees, people who are elected by the public to represent them in the school board. But also around 20 or so years ago, most fiscal matters were attracted by the province. So the school boards are nominally in charge of education, but they have little control over the fiscal aspects of providing education, because those are controlled by the province, which ends up, in this sometimes blame game, where the local boards point at the province and the province points at local boards, and no one really seems to be, where the buck stops, where responsibility finally ends. So these accommodation reviews are conducted by the local school board, and they identify schools that are underutilized, which historically has meant that some schools close. Okay, this is done by regions of the city. So a region of the city, so say Hamilton West or Hamilton Mountain or Hamilton East, will be reviewed as a group of schools. And then what's historically happened is that if schools are underutilized, one of them will be closed, and students, or the two schools, will be consolidated in a bigger one. So of the two schools, one survives, and that one school receives that capital funding for enlargement and improvement and renovations. So again, this idea of underutilization hints at the loss of population. So is it really the case that there has been a loss of population in the province to explain why schools need to be closed when they just are not used to capacity? And the story about population is not straightforward. In fact, Ontario is not losing population. Ontario has continued to grow. So the red line is historical data. So we see that from 2010 to 2020, Ontario has grown from about 12 million to 14 million. So the population is not going down. And then none of the projections are that there will be a loss of population in the province. Even the low growth scenario indicates that in the next couple of decades, Ontario will continue to gain at least 2 or 3 more million in population. And on the high growth scenario, it will actually grow to more than 25 million. Business as usual, still growth of about 4 more million. So population is not going down. But there are other processes in play as well. So while the population is not declining, what we have is a growing population of older people. So these are now the projections of population And we see that the youngest age cohort, so I have the preschool group, 0 to 5 years old, 5 to 18, so sort of the K to 12 education before higher education, and then everyone else, 18 to 90 plus. So the population 18 to 90 plus will continue growing fairly rapidly, but the youngest population, while not declining, is not projected to grow as rapidly. Okay, so while the province is not losing population, it's changing. The profile is changing with a lot more older people and a younger population of school age kids that grows only a little bit or not at all. And of course, as a geographer, I'm also interested in how that happens in space, because it's not only that there is this larger generational change of a graying population, but also that it happens unevenly. So this is Ontario, and you can see that some places are projected to lose to have a loss of population. So in the range of up to minus 10% change in population. That tends to happen in the more remote parts of the province. So the northern parts of the province that already have low populations. This big region here is not projected to lose population. Thunder Bay is about here. Thunder Bay is a major city in the province. And so really what this shows is that there is this continuation of urbanization trends. So there is not loss of population across the province, but regionally, we see that rural areas will remain stable at best, will depopulate to some extent at worst, and there will be small gains in some urban regions like Thunder Bay, and a lot more growth in places like this is Lake Ontario, this is the Golden Horseshoe, Toronto will be here, this is Ottawa, and so you see that the most urbanized parts of the province will actually not see a decline in population, will see, are expected to see a growth in population in that 5 to 19 age group. Zooming in to our region in the Golden Horseshoe, we see that the largest projected changes are in this region, in between Toronto and Hamilton, but none of the regions, these are census divisions, none of the census divisions in the Golden Horseshoe are projected to have declines in the 5 to 19 age group, with Hamilton seeing growth of 10 to 20% in that age group. So it's clear that there is not a loss of population, not when we look at the province. When we look regionally, we see that, yes, there will be likely rural regions that will lose some population, but that's not what's happening in the urbanized parts of the province. But even there, we see that there are differences. So despite the fact that there is not a loss of population, there's been a wave of school closures in the province, and Hamilton has not been an exception. So the white dots indicate schools that are active, and I didn't indicate which of those or the age of those schools. Some of them are newer, as I will mention. So all these are active schools. And the red squares are schools that closed sometime in the past 30 years or so, with some of the earliest closures in the late 70s and the most recent closures. And you see that, you know, quite a few of the schools closed in the past 20 years, at a time when projections by the province say that there was not going to be a decline in population that will demand attendance to those schools. So something else must be going on. What's happening is that some of those trends that we see at larger scales, they are also reflected at the more local scale. Some of the schools that closed in Hamilton, for instance, were rural schools, also places that have seen a decline in population. And schools are a hyper-localized asset. It doesn't matter if there is a school 200 kilometers away. It's not serving my population here. So schools are hyper-localized assets in that they serve a very, very local, very focalized population, right? So some schools that closed were rural schools, but also numerous schools in the core of the city and the older suburbs of the city. So, you know, suburbs that for a place like Hamilton, the oldest suburbs of the city are probably about 110 or 20 years old. So this has happened while the school board has continued to build new suburban schools. So let me go back to this map for a second. These are rural schools. This one here and this one here will be rural schools. And then we have this one here, also a rural school. And we see that in this case, there was really no replacement for these two schools that closed in those rural locations. This one, there is an active school nearby. So it is possible that, you know, it's a new building, that this was demolished and a new building was erected, or that there were two schools and it was consolidated. But pretty much all these schools will be in the core of the city or in the inner suburbs. And you can see that there is a lot of closures there. Whereas here, we have schools that were most likely built in the past 20 or at most 30 years, because this is all new developments. This is new suburban developments, newer suburban developments in the outside of the core of the city. So showing the population changes, and yes, we can see, like I was saying, some of those trends in population are also reflected at the smaller scale, with the more suburban and rural places of Hamilton projected to have a loss of population in the 5 to 19 age group. But interestingly, a lot of the places where schools closed are not projected to lose population. And in some cases, there is actually a projection that population will grow. This is actually historical information. So between 2001 and 2016, this is data from the census, population has actually grown in a lot of those places where schools were closing. So at the same time that schools were closing, the number of kids who needed to be sent to school was not going down. It was actually going up to some extent. Okay, so let me now ask you a question. What would you say is a school worth to you? In your experience as a student, or maybe as a parent who now sends their kids to school? Or maybe just as a resident, my friend Harvey Miller says, I'm happy to pay for public education because I don't want to live in a place full of ignorant people. So it may be even, be that that you have that motivation, even if you don't have kids to send to school, even if you're not going to school yourself anymore. There might be other reasons why you find that schools are valuable. So what would you say is a school worth to you? And this is an open-ended question, so feel free to say anything that that comes to mind. Okay, so provide kids with education is something that a lot of us will agree is worthwhile. Schools also provide activities for kids beyond the classroom. There is, you know, the value of education for a nation or even a province or even a city. There are discussions of, you know, do we offer the kind of education that will attract talented people to our city? So they help to form human capital and provide uniform social values. In fact, one of the reasons for public education in Canada was the need to have a uniform set of civic values in a country that was vast with very dispersed population. So it was part of a socialization process beyond education. Socialization, of course, cultural activities beyond what's done in the classroom, maybe forming critical citizens. We know that it's expensive. It's expensive to you know, interact with people who are not critical. They can also align with processes of gentrification. And if there is a school in the place where you live, in your living area, that provides opportunity, increases the quality of life, it provides structure to life as well. So a lot of different reasons why an education or schools are valuable. They provide those socialization, human capital, critical thought training, opportunities beyond the classroom, and so on and so forth. Some of them are assets that we benefit from. It doesn't matter where the school is. So, for instance, if I'm in a place that is losing population, maybe I don't really need a school here. But I'm happy that there are schools in places where kids can go to school and get an education, be trained, be socialized, and so on and so forth. Other aspects of schools are much more localized. So, for instance, those extra didactic activities, those extra activities beyond the classroom, well, they're not as valuable if they're across the city. They're valuable if, my kid can reach them, or if they're convenient for me to pick up my kid after school. If there is an after school program and I still need to pick up my kid, they need to be in a place that is convenient, right? Some of those other things like opportunities for extracurricular activities and some of the facilities that a school provides are only valuable if they are locally accessible. Okay, so the funny thing about this is that as long as some of us at least value some aspect of schools, that value becomes real. It's something that it's an intangible, but it becomes real. Just as long as some of us believe in that worth. With respect to that, and we can see that a lot of those responses are yes, schools are worthwhile. They provide a lot of valuable services, and for that reason, when schools close, it tends to be in situations that are disruptive and where there is a lot of bitterness. People are, as you can imagine, unhappy if a local school is selected for closure. Lots of, hard feelings. It creates a lot of division, and that's been documented in many different cases. The benefits of school closures are certain in a very narrow sense. We know that by closing a school, there is savings in maintenance and repair and operation of a building. A big factor in this region of the world is that heating is expensive, and heating a big old building that is underutilized, it's not the most efficient thing to do, right? So there are definitely savings in terms of closing a school. But then it's unclear that there are broader benefits and that there might in fact be important these benefits to school closure. So for instance, disruption of education. There's been a lot of studies that look at what happens to the academic performance of kids whose schools close, right? And it's not clear that it's necessarily beneficial. And as well, there is the possibility of other impacts to the economic and social well-being of the communities affected by school closures. And again, it's something that has been researched, and it's unclear that there are not longer-term negative impacts to those school closures. So the benefits are clear and immediate, but the potential negative impacts are diffuse and less clear, which makes for a discussion around school closures complicated. So we reached the point in the presentation where I get to tell you a story. So once upon a time, and once upon a time is actually about 10 years ago, there were two schools in adjacent neighborhoods. And these schools were in one of the old suburbs of Hamilton. So maybe the oldest suburb in Hamilton, what essentially is now adjacent to the core of the city. As we saw in the map, there was no loss of population or school-age population in those parts of the city. Still, the two schools in those neighborhoods were selected for an accommodation review. And as soon as that was announced, it became clear that likely one of those two schools would be closed. That's historically what has happened with accommodation reviews. The two schools were Prince Philip, and in this picture, this is actually, showing all the kids going to school. And as a local school, it was a school that had a high proportion of kids who walked and cycled to school. A lot of parents who walked and socialized around the school, and so on. And the second school was George R. Allen. And these are two adjacent neighborhoods. A lot of the people in these neighborhoods know each other. They're friends, they have friends of friends. So there is a lot of contact between them. So when the accommodation review was announced, there was this almost immediately, you could feel it, the fear that a community will be divided by a dispute about which school to close, where people, wouldn't want their school to close, but also wouldn't want the other school to close. But so very complicated feelings around that issue. And in that process, a parent whose kids attended Prince Philip sued a school board trustee. So the trustees, again, are the elected representatives in the school board. The parent sued the trustee, who was a resident in the other neighborhood with the other school. Okay. And both are neighbors, both the parent with kids in Prince Philip and the trustee, they live basically just a few blocks apart from each other. So what was the argument of this parent? He said that keeping the school in her own neighborhood open was worth something to the trustee. Okay, and as we have seen, people value schools for a lot of different reasons. So the parents say, keeping open the school in your own neighborhood means something valuable to you. It's something that is has worth to you, which obviously poses a conflict of interest. The trustee will get to vote on decisions about the accommodation reviews and so on and so forth, but those decisions were impacted by whatever sense of worth the trustee had on her local school. So eventually, this lawsuit was settled out of court, and the parent admitted that the trustee was not aware of the conflict of interest. So the trustee insisted that they were not aware of the schools having value to her. And the parent eventually agreed that, okay, any conflict of interest was accidental. It was not malicious in any way. But the underlying issue was that there was no evidence that the school had capitalization value through the value of properties. And I know that because I was actually an expert in that suit. The argument of the trustee and the school board was that no, schools don't have any capitalization value in property. Therefore, the trustee does not benefit from keeping the school open. And there was no evidence that there was that capitalization process. Even if we know from evidence in other jurisdictions that schools often have some capitalization value through properties. Now here, what we can say is that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It was not enough to carry on that suit, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. It's possible that the trustee was unaware, but it doesn't mean that there is no capitalization of schools. And fortunately, what we have as a tool is hedonic price analysis. That is a family of techniques based on econometric and statistical principles that allow us to tease out the implicit prices of things for which there is no market. This is the case of many bundled goods, and real estate property is a prime example of that. There is a market for real estate. There is a market for houses. There is a market for condos. There is a market for apartments, but there is no market for windows in houses. There is no market for basements in houses. There is no market for proximity to schools that houses have. Those things come as a bundle. So while we know the value of a property when it is sold and bought, so we know what is the market price of that, we don't immediately know how much of that value is or corresponds to the number of windows, the size of the house, the backyard, how close it is to schools. So hedonic price analysis allows us to tease out those implicit prices. How much does a room contribute to the overall value of the house? And in a similar way, we can question how much is the value of being close to a school. And it is possible that being close to a school has zero value, just as it is possible that some fixture in the house is not necessarily valued, and in fact, it may devalue the property. I'm thinking of some houses that I saw when I was in the market for a house a few years ago, and I went to a house that had this carpeting from the 60s, and I'm thinking, oh man, that is going to be expensive to replace. So not only it did not add value to the house, it actually devalued the property. So one technique that is by now widely utilized, this was kind of a novelty in the mid-90s with breakground papers by a number of people. This has become pretty much the state of the practice for doing hedonic price analysis when it comes to real estate. So it's a spatial hedonic model. As you can see, it's a regression model that has the price as the outcome variable. That is often transformed as the log of price for a number of different reasons. But in general terms, we have the price on the left-hand side of the equation. And then on the right-hand side of the equation, we have X, which is a collection of structural attributes like the size of the house, the number of bedrooms, the number of bathrooms, the presence of a pool, and so on and so forth. Neighborhood attributes such as the profile of the neighborhood, the demographic profile of the neighborhood, the socioeconomics of the neighborhood, and so on and so forth. And then accessibility attributes such as how close it is to the central business district or to employment, how close it is to schools, and so on. The spatial component of this model, there are two. One is a lagged price component, and the second is a spatial lag of the attributes X. So what this says in broad terms is that prices have this interaction effect in space or spillovers, that people pay attention to the price of the neighboring properties. Whereas this component says that people pay attention to the attributes of the neighboring components and they care about them. Okay, so this model can be reduced in a few different ways. So we can eliminate the spatial lag and end up with a spatial Durbin model. We can eliminate the lag of the X's and end up with a spatial lag model. And we can do other transformations to end up with a spatial error model. And so these are all specifications that can be tested empirically. This is this figure shows the prices of houses in Hamilton in 2016. This is the third quarter of 2016. And so we see that properties tend to be more valuable in the suburbs of Hamilton. As you will expect, they tend to be bigger properties and so on and so forth, and a little bit lower in the central parts of the city. Also typically smaller properties and so on and so forth. The variables that we have for this analysis include, like I said, the structural attributes. So this is what you will find in any hedonic model of house prices. So the age of the structure, the name of the bathrooms, anything related to the structure. The neighborhood attributes like the demographic profiles, mobility status of the neighborhood, and so on. So I'm not going to spend time discussing this because these are the things that you will find in any hedonic model of housing prices. What we're interested in instead is the variables that relate to schools. And here we have the network distance to the school in the catchment area. Okay, so the schools have catchment areas that are defined by the school board. We looked at the properties and then calculated the network distance to the school in the catchment area. And we did this by type of school. And by type, we think of elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools. So we have this hierarchy of schools, fairly standard. So elementary is K to 5, and then middle is 6 to 8, and then high 9 to 12. And in addition, we look at the results of the standardized tests. Here I'll just ask you to remind that this is mean-centered because that influences the interpretation of that. So we take the test results for the schools in the city, and we center them on the mean and look at deviations from the mean. Schools that have scores below the mean and schools that have scores above the mean. And so we incorporate a couple of things. One is accessibility to those facilities, and also, to some extent, the quality. I know that there are a lot of problems with standardized test results or standardized testing, but it does give at least some indication of the academic performance of the school. So it tells us something at least about school quality. This is an example of the extensive exploratory spatial data analysis that John completed. And this is a correlogram showing the correlation between neighbors by number of nearest neighbors. So this is the same as looking at a property and all the neighbors up to K and calculating the correlation between them, the spatial correlation, and the corresponding p-values. So here we see that there is this strong patterning in housing prices. That housing prices that are neighbors, they tend to be very similar with correlations of upwards of 0.3, and that similarity tends to dilute with distance. To the effect that once that we start looking at neighbors beyond, the 150th neighbor, that similarity basically has vanished. This is important, and we can also see it in the previous map. That yes, we have sort of these patches of high values, low values, intermediate values, and tend to be very consistent over space. So having done the exploratory spatial data analysis, the process then was to estimate a model to tease out those implicit prices of different attributes. And here the specification search involves canceling some elements of the more general hedonic model that we saw before. So maybe canceling some variables because they were not significant, or maybe testing whether there is a spatial lag or whether there is a error, spatial error autocorrelation or residual pattern, and so on. So we tested a few different models, a conventional econometric model with no spatial effects, then a spatial lag model with a lag price, and a spatial Durbin model with a lag of the independent variables. For the spatial weights, we used a distance decay function that was fit on the correlogram that I showed before. We saw that similarity declines over distance, and that's reflected in the spatial weights. The weights decline with in an inverse way with the distance between properties. So here, what I will note is that the rate of decay is relatively slow. You see that there is a square root. the rate of decay will be faster if this was just dij to the 1, and even faster if it was the square or the cube or the fourth power and so on and so forth. So the rate of decay is relatively slow in this case. So we take those special weights, and then as is common practice, they were both standardized for the analysis. So looking at the different models, we have the base econometric model, the spatial lag model, the spatial error model, and the spatial Durbin model. And what this table reports is the diagnostics for Moran's I of the residuals. And we see that the base model has significant spatial autocorrelation in the residuals. So we know that that's problematic for a lot of reasons, and we would rather not see that. The spatial lag model still doesn't solve the issue with the residual autocorrelation. The spatial error model gets there with marginally significant residual autocorrelation. But the model that really solved things for us here was the spatial Durbin model, a model that doesn't have a lag, it doesn't have residual autocorrelation. In fact, lagging the independent variables was sufficient to solve the residual pattern and capture all systematic variability in the process that we're modeling. So in addition to that, we see the AIC, the Akaike information criterion value, and we see that the spatial Durbin model also gives the best results. So based on this, we decided to work with the spatial Durbin model as our model that doesn't have spatial autocorrelation and that gives the best statistical fit. Okay, so this gives a sense of the performance of the model. On the x-axis, we have the log of price, and on the y-axis, we have the predictions. This is the observed values, and this is the predicted values using our spatial Durbin model. And we see that the model actually performs really, really well. We don't have a lot of distortion. We have a strong linear relationship between our predictions and our observations. So one thing to note about the marginal effects, like I said, the hedonic model allows us to tease out the marginal, the implicit prices of the attributes of a bundle good. Technically, what that means is that we can get the marginal effect. We can ask questions like, what will be the value of one additional brome? So that's the marginal effect. If we change something in the margin, how does that change our outcome? Okay. Now, in a conventional econometric model, the marginal effects are given directly by the coefficients of the model, by the parameters. We can look at the parameter, and that becomes the that's essentially the marginal effect. When we have a log dependent variable, like in this case, so we have the log of price equals, then the marginal effect is interpreted as a percentage change. Okay. Now, with the spatial Durbin model or with the other spatial models, the coefficients do not directly give the marginal effect. And the reason for that is that these spatial effects represent complex patterns of spatial spillovers. So when we change something, say, what will be the effect of changing, adding one brome to this property? That potentially has an impact on the property, but because of the lagged effect, it also impacts the neighboring properties. And the neighboring properties impact their own neighbors, and so on and so forth. And Jim Lesage, for instance, has done a lot of work investigating, those effects and shown that they act like multipliers. So any change in X at I tends to propagate throughout the system. So we cannot just look at the coefficient and say that's the marginal effect. in fact, we have to calculate that propagation of effects to be able to get those marginal effects. Okay, so these are the results of the analysis, estimating the models, and for comparison, there is the Bayes regression without spatial effects, and then our spatial Durbin model with the spatial coefficients, the coefficients for the spatial lag, and then the total spatial effect, which ends up being the marginal effect. Okay, so if we look at the third and fourth columns, those are the coefficients, but they do not really tell us how things change when something changes in the excess. What really tells us that is the total spatial effect. So we can interpret this as the direct effect, but then the multiplier effect is given by this column. Okay, and like I said, these are all sort of structural attributes like the age of the house, the status of different parts of the house, like basements, the number of bedrooms, and so on and so forth. You find that in thousands of papers, so I'm not going to discuss that in detail. Instead, I would like you to concentrate on these items in the breadbox. They are the scores. The first three items there are the scores, the standardized test scores for primary schools, for middle schools, and for high schools. Okay, and then the next three columns are the network distances to primary school, to middle school, and to high school. Okay, so we see that there are several of those variables that are significant in terms of their total spatial effects. For instance, the scores of primary schools are significant and have a negative coefficient. Since the dependent variable is the log of price, this is interpreted as a percentage change. So this is minus 6.2%. What does that mean? It means that the scores are valued by families who are in the market for houses, and schools with scores below the mean, the citywide mean, tend to be associated with lower values of houses in their catchment area. Okay, and schools with positive values, they tend to have an appreciation of that. Then we have the distance. And again, we have that distance is significant, distance to primary schools, to middle schools, and to high schools. It is interesting to notice the size of the coefficients as well. The biggest one is for primary schools. The smallest one is for high school. And this reflects more or less the way kids reach those facilities. So in neighborhood schools, they mostly walk, and independent mobility is more important at the level of primary and middle schools. And then by the time kids reach high schools, they already use more different ways to get there. So they use public transportation, they walk, they cycle, maybe they drive to school, and so on. So that effect of proximity is weakened to some extent. It doesn't vanish, but it's weakened to some extent. Okay, so what this means is that the distance to a school is associated with a change of minus 7.3% in value for each kilometer of distance to a primary school, minus 3.9% for each kilometer of distance to a middle school, and minus 1.4% for each kilometer of distance to a high school. Okay, so what does that mean in terms of what is school worth to a neighborhood? That the total effect of distance to schools is significant. Properties that are closer to school tend to be more valuable, and this is true for all schools, primary, middle, and high schools. The distance decay effect is in the terms that I mentioned before. It ranges from -1.4 to -7.3% per kilometer distance. To give you a sense of what that means, this is a primary school. The black box is the location of the school, and then we have the equal distance lines on the network to that school. So 1 kilometer is about this, and it covers a good chunk of that neighborhood. Okay, so almost every property here will benefit to some extent by being closer to that primary school, and the closest will benefit the most. In fact, according to the model, the houses that are right next to the school tend to be the most valuable, other things being equal. Okay. So back to our tale. This tale didn't have a witch, or if it did, the witch didn't know that she was evil. But the school that the two schools that I told you, Prince Philip and George R. Allen, the two were reviewed for accommodation, and the school board voted to close Prince Philip. This is the announcement in the newspaper of that result. And the decision was made by a vote of 6-5. And the deciding vote was cast by the trustee, who is a neighbor of the George R. Allen School. In other words, the trustee who was sued because of a conflict of interest cast the deciding vote to close the school, not in her neighborhood, but in the neighborhood across the avenue. Okay? So that is history. Prince Philip closed already maybe 7 or 8 years ago. But what if the board had voted to not close the school? I mean, that is a counterfactual that we don't have because the school did close. But the power of models is that we can use them to examine hypothetical questions like this. What will happen if? Okay, so I'm going to show you how I waved my magic spatial Durbin model and restored that school that was closed. So we're calling this our base scenario. Our base scenario is not reality. It's what would have happened if, where this is George R. Allen, and this is Prince Philip, and Prince Philip never closed. So with our model, we can simulate putting back Prince Philip and looking at the values of the properties there. Okay, so we can simulate that and estimate what will properties in these neighborhoods be if Prince Philip was still there. And
Antonio,
then,
sorry, you have another 5 minutes, otherwise we don't leave enough time for discussion.
Perfect. This is getting close to the end. So this is showing what would have happened if the school hadn't closed. Now we can take our model and see, well, let's take out one school, let's take out the other school. And what we see is that this is what happened in reality, but we're estimating, we're recreating that with our model. So if Prince Philip had closed, and we see that there was an estimated change in the values of properties, and it was negative, even for the properties in the other neighborhood. If we had closed, if George R. Allen had closed instead, there was also a loss. It would have been concentrated in the neighborhood where that school closed, but also the properties on the other neighborhood would have been affected. So one key here is that everybody is worse off. And this is because of those complex spillover effects. The difference in the prices is negative, even for properties whose school didn't close. The spillover effects reach beyond the boundaries. And so some people lose more than others, but everybody ends up with a lower value of their house than would have been otherwise the case. And as you saw in the figure, some people are worse off than others. So considering the in-sample properties only, and there are 212 of them, how much do you think was the loss in property values in the aggregate? And you don't need to do the math. Just estimate a quick estimate of what do you think will have been the aggregated, the total change in the value of those properties? Okay, let's take a look at what you think. That a few of you think that the losses did not exceed 1 million. Maybe they were in the range of 1 to 4 million. A few of you think that it was more than that. Yeah, so most of you think that the total loss in value did not exceed 4 million. Our estimated changes, if George R. Allen had closed, is almost 5 millions difference. So a loss of value of close to 5 millions. And our estimated loss in value for Prince Philip is still over 4 millions. And this is just the properties in the sample. It doesn't account for the hundreds of other properties in those neighborhoods. Okay, this is just looking at the sample of the properties in those neighborhoods. So even just looking at that, there was this potential loss of value that was in the millions range. It was not trivial. It could be argued that voting to close Prince Philip was the lesser evil. As we saw, there was a somewhat smaller loss. But we might question why closing these schools at all, especially seeing that population is not declining. And could it be that closing those schools causes a community greater economic loss than the savings? So that the school board saves money in maintenance and operation, but by doing that, it destroys value in a community. And we can see that the estimates of how much value was potentially destroyed was not trivial. It was millions of dollars, and that's just a cross-sectional estimate. Imagine how that compounds over time. So properties that did not value more, did not gain value or lost value, and that compounds year after year after year after year after year after year. We might also question whether closing urban and inner suburban schools, like I showed before, is not really a transfer of wealth out of the city core. in addition to being terrible urban planning, because it encourages that kind of sprawling development outside of the core of the city. So in summary, this is evidence that I wish we had 10 years ago, that schools seem to capitalize their value through properties. That this clearly poses a conflict of interest. If the conflicted trustee had abstained in this case, Prince Philip will not have closed. When votes are tied, the motion doesn't pass, and the motion was to close that one school. So if the trustee had declared the conflict of interest and abstained from voting, the school will still be there. And more broadly, this raises questions about the process of accommodation reviews and the economic wisdom of closing schools in on time. So what is next? Some ideas about what comes next in terms of research. The fate of closed schools. Some are converted to other useful uses, but many are not. And also the question, what happens over time? Do communities recover, or is that loss something that just compounds over time? So thank you, Ale, for the reminder. And I will finish at this point, and feel free to give me a big round of applause. Thank you.
Virtual big round of applause.
Excellent, and happy to take questions, listen to comments, and so on.
So yes, let me know if there are any questions from PhD students, especially. Let's start with the junior people. If not, I do have some comments, but I would rather let the junior people speak first. So if you raise your hand, I'll know that you have a question, or just write it in the chat, whatever. It's early morning for you, but it's as if it's early morning for us, apparently.
Yes, there is some light finally.
Or it's me, because I heard that the students were very active last time and I was not in attendance. So probably it's me scaring them, because when I'm in attendance, nobody speaks. Okay, so I'll let them think for a while, but I do expect them to ask questions at some point. And in the meantime, I'm starting the discussion. So maybe, yes, you know, we can do it like that and see if they unblock themselves. Okay, so I think one of the most interesting results that struck me is that, of course, you find a different result for different types of schools, going to elementary, middle school, and high schools. And of course, you talk about the distance decay, the different ways that they go to school. But I was just thinking, if it's not also the value that parents give to different types of schools. So I was thinking about myself. I always think about myself when I look at pieces that somehow relate to my life. And personally, I feel that getting a good elementary school, which doesn't mean that I did get one in L'Aquila, unfortunately, but good, at least trying to get the best elementary school that you can. It's very important, especially at elementary school level, whether it's because we are more protective of our kids when they're younger, or because we believe that this is what I believe. I believe that actually elementary school is really what gives you a good start or a bad start. Even though I went to a very bad elementary school, actually. It was in terrible neighborhoods, but maybe it shows. So I was just thinking about, but also, okay, here is a question. Is there a perception that the variance in quality between these three types of school is different? In a sense, if you believe that elementary schools are either very, very, very bad or very, very, very good, you are more likely to spend to be in a good neighborhood to get a good elementary school, because you are so scared of the one that are at the bottom. If you believe that this variance somehow becomes less as you go up middle school, or maybe it's the opposite, I don't know, but I was just thinking about that. If you believe that, you know, high schools, there are bad high schools and good high schools, but are less, so maybe then, you are less concerned about where you locate with the house. So this is my first question. Is it just a distance decay, or is it just that parents value elementary, middle school, and high school differently, and they're more concerned, especially for all sorts of different reasons, about the elementary school first? I'll give you all my things, and then you can just answer all together. Okay, so I'm thinking about Columbus, Ohio. So I left just before my son started elementary school, but I did all the bureaucratic procedure for Alex to go to elementary school actually in Columbus, because I didn't know I was leaving, so I had to do it a year before. And so in the US, you cannot go to an elementary school or another school which is outside your neighborhood if it's a public school, if you don't pay for it. If it's private, it's another thing. So it's not a matter of just picking the closest one because it's close to you, but that's because the only choice you have. There are some exceptions in the sense that you can go to a school which is not in your neighborhood, not in your catchment area, but you have to pay very high fees. So there is price discrimination there. And so people obviously locate in where they know that the best schools are, because that's the only way to gain access to the school. You can't otherwise, even if you want to, and even if you pay, you cannot get access anyway, because you are on a waiting list. So I was just wondering whether in Canada the school system works exactly like that, or it's different. And then my last thought was, so it's interesting that you found that you have this perfect distance decay, right, in your weight matrix, the correlation and everything. Because again, I'm thinking about Columbus. We had ghettos in Columbus. So we had neighborhoods that were surrounded by fantastic neighborhoods, but then themselves were terrible. And so we had holes in the system. It was not as smooth. So your regression would have had a problem in there, because, we had really like a Swiss cheese, holes in Columbus, in which they were really, really bad, surrounded by very good neighborhoods, and vice versa. And so I was just wondering if it's more common in Canada, what you find, and if it's more common what I had in Columbus, or what. I mean, if it's applicable, what you find also to the US, or if you think that there are more kind of clusters, I don't know how to call them in the US.
Thank you. Those are great questions. One thing that I think happens is that there is this sense that we are exceptional in some way. So we're not the United States, but we're also not Europe. So that is why having local evidence is super important, because if you come and say, this is what happens in the United States, and then people will tell you, yeah, but we're not the United States. Or if you say, but look, this is what happens in Europe, and they will say, but we're not Europe. So it's really important to have that local, that local base of evidence. So this ties to your questions in a number of different ways. So for instance, there is a question of what happens if you have ghettos or enclaves that will be more deprived and that sort of are surrounded by more advantaged neighborhoods. So you have this sort of mosaic. That relates to the question of the quality of the schools as well. In the United States, for instance, you see a lot of that voting with your feet, where people vote to tax themselves by moving to neighborhoods with very, very good schools, right? So they're willing to and able to move to a neighborhood that is expensive if it has a good school. And as we've seen, the properties that are expensive partly because of the presence of the school, especially if it is good. So Canada is a little bit different, at least Ontario and Hamilton, in that the quality of schools is more homogeneous than in the United States. There is not as wide range of disparity between the performance of schools. Despite other things, I mean, our American neighbors will say that that's socialism, that you don't have enough differences. But in a way, you can go to a public school anywhere in Hamilton, and it will not be terrible. It may not be, the best in the city, but it's not terrible. Okay, so you don't have that sort of, or not to the extent that you will see it in the United States, that people will choose neighborhoods based on the quality of the schools factoring. And anecdotally, when that process of reviewing the schools happened a few years ago, actually quite a few of the parents say that they had moved to one of these neighborhoods, not necessarily because the school was good, but because the school was walkable. They really wanted to take advantage of a school where their kids could walk to school, being in a place where their kids could walk to school. So the sense that we get is that school quality matters, but independent mobility by children also seems to be quite important. And that's, I think, what we see in these distance decay effects. I completely agree with you that the way we see those effects being stronger for primary school than for high school have to do with the perception and even the reality that getting a good start is more important. If you do well early, then you continue to do well. It's just one of those things that creates momentum. But if you struggle early, then that just makes things difficult later on, right? So the combination of being relatively close to a school and the perception of the importance of the different levels of schooling is greater when it comes to primary schools. Hey, hi, Alex.
Sorry, now I have my son joining the seminar. The phone rang.
We met before.
We are
have
listening
to go for
you.
gelato. The other question is that of what happens with out of catchment students, and out of catchment is more the exception than the rule. So it's not encouraged, but it's allowed in cases. And so it does happen, but it tends to be a small proportion of students who go to out of catchment schools. I should say that all our analysis is based on the public system. So it includes the public school board and the Catholic school board. It doesn't include private schools, which at least in Hamilton, I don't know how extended or how common this view will be, but private schools are not as common. And the sense that I get, and keep in mind that I'm surrounded by people who are professionals, who are professors at universities, and so on and so forth. Sending your kids to a private school is seen as a little bit snobbish. Because the public system is actually really good. So sending your kids to a private school is like, not so much for the quality of education, but because it's a little bit like this, right? It's you're pointing your nose up. So not as common, and we did not include them in our analysis. I ignore if they also face school closures. I don't think they do, but the vast majority of kids in the system will be in one of the two parallel public school systems. So I think that's important, because obviously, if it was a private school, the catchment doesn't really factor in. You can go to whatever school you want as long as you pay for it. If it's a private school. Wonder if that answers your questions.
Yeah, that clarified everything. So now we have 3 hands raised. I'll go in order of seniority, starting from the youngest, though. So Giulia, she's a PhD student of ours.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for this interactive presentation. Really interesting. And no, I have not. I'm not a real question, but some comments from real life. And because when you go to the website to find houses and to rent or to buy houses, there is a website in Italy where you can put the preference near to a school or near to services, and it's like something that it's really quite relate to these kind of issues and can really change the preferences of people in choosing places. And the other comment, it's quite linked to the question of Alessandra about quality of schools. I take the example of Rome because I'm from Rome. And for example, here you can go to the schools that are considered the best in the center. Only if you are in the ranking, you go up in the ranking if you live near the school. And but the other key issue for me is that this kind of schools is not only about quality, but the schools in the center offer offer a diverse kind of education profiles. Okay, different courses, more international, more I don't know, about arts or something like that. And when you go outside and in the suburbs, this kind of courses are lower, so are not offered, I think. And so it's not only about maybe quality, but kind of, this is for example, for high school. So you maybe people just to relocate near to school that offer this kind of course of study or another one that maybe could be a key.
Those are great points. So the first one, the information in the listings, and I think it's become a lot more common that you can go to a website and do a search and see what properties are on the market, and then you filter by different attributes. So one thing that that started to become common a few years ago, I don't know if you have seen a website called Walk Score. It's a website. It was developed in the United States, but I think it works in many different countries, and it tells you for a neighborhood how easy it is to walk there. It will calculate, a few different things and tell you this is a walker's paradise, or no, you cannot walk here. So listings in Canada started putting information about the walk score when announcing properties. That was to me a sign that people were increasingly interested in that aspect of the neighborhood, right? Is it a place where I can walk? And you can do a search and filter anything that has a walk score less than 70, I don't care. I'm not interested in, right? So I imagine that something similar happens with the schools, that you can target your preferences in a more precise way. And that ties back to my story of the trustee, because the argument of the trustee and the lawyer of the school board was that no, people don't care about schools. That's why there is no capitalization value. But the argument was that imagine that you have a preference for houses with no windows, okay? And then you say, why should I pay for the windows of this house? I don't like windows. I don't want any windows. I don't want to pay for that. So you may have that preference, but as long as some people like windows and want them, you have to outbid them. You have to pay more than they do if you want that property, even if you don't want windows, right? So in the case of schools, that argument was not very strong, because it was like, yeah, I'm sure that there are people who don't care about schools, but it doesn't matter. As long as some of us do, it's going to be reflected in the price. Now, you may not care about the school, but if anyone else thinking of buying a house does, and is willing to pay a little bit more than you, then you have to pay more than they do, right? And it has to be captured that way. Providing information just makes it a little bit more, I guess, efficient to process that information. If you have that in the listing, walkable, 200 meters to a school, and you see that, and it just makes it easier to capture that attribute in the preferences. The second item about the quality of the schools, but going beyond not just the quality, but what the offerings are. And you're absolutely right. Here in Hamilton, there is a high school that is well known for its arts program. It has a great drama program and visual arts and so on and so forth. So if you are a kid who is inclined to take drama or to study art in high school, that's where you go. It doesn't matter if it's in your catchment area. There is another school that has a great science program. So kids who are aiming for going into a science program in university, that's the place to be, right? So partly I think that the reason why, or another reason why this the distance decay is weaker when it comes to high schools is that there is also greater differentiation with schools that sort of have these specializations. I couldn't tell you how many students are in schools because of the programs, but it's something that happens, right? Whereas elementary schools tend to be a lot more uniform. They tend to come with a standard set of features. They don't yet have a specialized program in the arts or a specialized program in the sciences. They come with a gym, they come with a computer room, they come with the same programming, more or less, with less distinction. So again, what happens there is not what is at the school, because most schools will have the same, but rather how close you are to the school.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now we have Fernanda. You do share the country of origin with Fernanda.
Yeah, indeed. So thank you, Antonio, for your presentation. I just have this question. How do you approximate to the distance issue? Because normally if you estimate like an Euclidean distance, it's linear. And normally it does not take into account how intricate can be like a network of how you walk. I don't know how is the case of Hamilton, Ontario, but if you can.
Yes, it actually is, and also because of an important feature in the city. The city is part of the Niagara Escarpment, so there is this thing that locals call the mountain. It's not really a mountain; it's more like a plateau. But there is a big feature that in places has a height of maybe 40 or 50 meters. So the city is very strongly divided between the core and the older suburbs, and then above the escarpment, you have the newer suburbs and the rural areas. Of course, that means that people do not walk up and down the mountain, and that needs to be taken into account. If it was something that you measured with Euclidean distance, well, a school that appears to be really close, it's actually a long distance on the network. Here we did use the network distance precisely for those reasons. So all the distance were measured on the network, now it's a lot easier to do that. I mean, a few years ago, you will have to have been an expert in GIS to calculate network distances. You'll have had to buy the networks from a specialized vendor and so on and so forth. We have actually done all this research or most of it. John used ArcGIS at some point early on, but I really encourage him to switch to working with open software. So most of this has been done, and that includes the calculation of the network distances. That has all been done in R. We used a routine that was developed by Chris Higgins, the co-author in this paper, to calculate network distances using a package called R5R that was developed in Brazil by Rafa Pereira. So with that package, we can calculate network distances and times, travel times by different modes. So we did take that into account. It's something that has become increasingly accessible. And in fact, Chris and I with Rafa Pereira are working on a new paper that will present a family of notebooks, R notebooks, to do those calculations in a sort of simplified way.
Thank you very much. Now we go to Fabiano Compagnucci, who is assistant professor at the GSI.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Antonio, very much for your timely and interesting presentation. I have one curiosity and one question. The first one was the same of Fernanda. And so why not to take into account also time distances according to different means of transport, which means, for instance, by walk, by bike, by car, which is also important in order to understand which is the impact on the different social and income groups. This is the first one, but you yet answered. The second one is a curiosity. It regards basically a phenomenon which is occurring for instance, in the Bay Area. So there are some school districts which are raising aging school buildings. And for instance, they send their students to new facilities, and they turn that land into affordable rental housing for teachers and school workers, because the price, for instance, in the Bay Area, the house market price is so high that public workers cannot afford to live in San Francisco, but they have to commute for hours in order to reach their facilities. So I just wanted to know if, and this, of course, as you showed us in your last slide, conflict of interest. Of course, there are conflict of interest between the local community, which are not eager to see that schools are relocated away from their neighborhoods, and the interest of public workers, which needs to be close to the place where they do live. So I just wanted to know if in Canada you are experiencing a similar situation.
Thank you, Fabiano. Those are really interesting questions. So for the first one, I will just add, in addition to what I mentioned before in response to Fernanda's question, that we did try in our models busing times. And those were not significant. So we did not include them in the final model, but we did consider, well, are people still willing to, pay that bit of a premium if instead of, being a walkable school, it's by bus, and it turned out not to be significant. And then with respect to cycling, that's a really interesting point. We just did network distance, and did not look into cycling and walking times, which obviously will be different. But Hamilton is not a very cyclable city. So I don't know statistics. I don't know off the top of my head statistics. In fact, one of my students is working on a project on that. But how common is cycling among, say, elementary school students? So at the moment, we sort of, bypass that question because we did not have enough information about it. But I think that is something that, especially as the city becomes more cyclable, that is going to be important. The other question about whether we're seeing, that sort of displacement, that, the rents become very high, and San Francisco is obviously a prime example of that people who work in the city cannot afford to live in the city. Here I think that not to the same extent, but something similar has happened. Like I suggested in the map, there is in one of the maps that I showed, most school closures have been in the center of the city. That tends to be lower socioeconomic and status. So incomes tend to be lower in the center of the city. Education also tends to be, academic achievement tends to be a little bit lower. Higher proportion of immigrants live there, and so on. So I think that what has happened is this equity issue, where schools that closed in those places basically transfer the cost of transportation to those families, right? Because now kids, instead of being able to go to a walkable neighborhood school, now they have to bus or they have to take public transportation. So at least they're spending more time there. They're probably also paying for it in other ways, right? And at the same time, building capacity in newer developments. So it's not only that I suspect there has been this transfer of wealth in terms of closing schools, depresses values in the neighborhoods where they close. At the same time, you're building new schools, which is adding value to properties elsewhere in the suburbs, but also by saying, oh, we save money by closing this school. Those savings are also mask or obscure the cost of now who needs to travel longer. Because the school board saves money directly, but someone else is paying for it. At the very least, in the time that they spend commuting to school, right? And that process has been very unequal in Hamilton. So it does have that, it's not quite the commuters, but I think it does reflect some of those inequities that potentially happen as part of a process like this.
On defense of Antonio, I think that Hamilton is very cold to use the bike. I found Columbus cold, and Hamilton is much colder than Columbus.
You must remind that they use the bike in Norway all the year, and we have also a lot of examples for the elementary school in the Emilia-Romagna region, where there are a group of people which organize these pupils, and they go together in order to reach the school. So it's I'm going to say a matter of habit.
But Emilia-Romagna is not cold, at least.
And that, I think it's one of those things that are changing in Hamilton with respect to cycling.
Columbus was minus 25 degrees in winter. I mean,
yeah. I mean, you get days like that in Hamilton as well, and nobody wants to cycle.
When it's cold there, I can guarantee you. Okay, last but not least, Sandro, who is full professor. We are the only two full professors in our area, the GSSI. He is an expert on innovation, especially. Bye, Sandro.
Right. So, Antonio, first of all, let me thank you very much for a number of things. First of all, for having shown us how productive a person can be early in the morning or late at night, depending on how you look at it. It's really terrific how productive you can be. Second, thank you for having stimulated at least myself in doing an investment in interactive procedure of presenting. I think we will definitely think about investing in a Mentimeter in our teaching. I think it's really effective. And third, thank you very much for your interesting presentation, about which I have just a small comment. I mean, it's quite late here, so maybe we should approach the end. I think it's not really possible to improve the predictive power of your Hedonic model. I was impressed by how accurate the predictions are. So maybe the comment that I have applies to an extension to this model in other contexts where the fitness could be possibly lower. And the comment that I have comes for a thought that I made when you induced me thinking about my time of going to school, right? At those times, there was this idea, which I don't know, is still valuable nowadays, that the school is valuable if somehow fits the social cultural backgrounds of the parents. that was something that I'm not so sure whether also drove the decision of my family to send me to that school. I suspect that that's been so, right? But stimulated by this thinking, I was wondering whether the hedonic model could be somehow augmented by integrating, in addition to the geographical proximity to the residence of the owner, a sort of social cultural proximity between, you know, the cultural background of a school, whether it can be identified, and those of the owner. You know what I mean?
Yes, yes. Thank you for the for your kind words and for the comment. So I will say that I have been using Menti for over a year now, and the students have enjoyed the ability to sort of interact with me with, you know, questions and things like that. So I wish that McMaster had a site license. We don't, so I pay for that out of my pocket. But I wish that Mac had a site license for it. I agree with your perspective that, you know, there is some cultural affinity, and having gone to primary school in several places in Mexico, one of the schools that I attended was was funded by Republican Spanish exiles from the Civil War. And so that school will have a lot of people who were second generation Spanish immigrants that had fled the Civil War in Spain, right? So there was a culture to it, and people were attracted to it. Here in Canada, I think that the main difference is between public and private. And like I said, you know, that difference is maybe a little bit in terms of quality, that private schools tend to be consistently better quality, but not to the extent that I would say. I mean, I could afford to send my kids to private school, but I don't, because the public schools are good. There is no point in spending money on that. So there is a little bit of a cultural difference there in terms of sending kids to public or private. I would say that that's maybe the biggest difference. And then within the public system, there is also, our system is so inefficient. There is the public and the Catholic boards. And the public board offers English and French, as well as the Catholic board offers English and French. So we have, essentially 4 parallel systems based on the language of instruction and whether it's public or Catholic. For Catholic, well, obviously, a lot of people who are Catholic will send their schools to Catholic schools. It's not such a strong difference as I would say is in Mexico with Catholic schools. And then the other sort of, division or cleavage is between French and English. And you can choose, Catholic French, public English, public French, and so on. The system is designed in such a way that mostly everything is offered in every catchment area. It is just in the case of some French programs that kids are captured from a bigger catchment because their local school doesn't offer French. That's one of those complications that we didn't incorporate in the model, and it might be interesting to tease out those things by looking not just at the schools by primary, middle, and high, but also by primary Catholic French, primary public English, and so on.
Yeah.
In terms of improving the model, and just to conclude, the best thing of finishing with a model and then checking for the residuals is that once that we're satisfied they are random and we check them, there is no spatial autocorrelation, everything seems to be fine, is that there is nothing that you will possibly add that could make the model better, because essentially what is left is white noise, right? So this is a model that could not be improved. what can be done is maybe split a few different things in different ways. And that's not going to explain more in terms of capturing more of the variance, but maybe it's going to explain more in terms of teasing out the variations in those effects.
All right, well, 1:30 exactly. Let me just finish by the congratulation by Thea, who's one of our students as well. She says, thank you for the engaging presentation, probably one of the best we had. So
thank you. Always
this
happy
is
to hear
like
that.
a final applause, right? Antonio, we let you go because you were very generous with your time, and we know that you woke up very early in the morning. I really do hope, like most of my colleagues, I'm absolutely certain, to see you face to face soon. In the meantime, we thank you very much. I have to join Sandro in saying that I didn't know that this system existed to have an interaction presentation with students. So I will check it out and make sure that maybe we even get a license for this. So we learn not only about the price of houses and hedonic modeling, but also how to maybe become better online teachers. Thank you very much, Antonio.
Thank you so much, Alessandra, and I hope to be able to visit again sometime soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you. Have a
bye,
great
bye.
day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Antonio. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye, Antonio.
Bye, Julia.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.